Hello, lovely people. Miss Henderson here. I just wanted to put together a short lecture about Jekyll and Hyde. And I'm looking at some different things in the lecture that I pulled together from reading that I've done and things that I've seen and my own kind of interpretation of the text. And predominantly, I'm going to be looking at Stevenson's purpose. So I hope it's helpful. And sorry if I don't look like I'm looking at you. I am actually looking at the information that I want to share with you. So let's start. So the lecture is kind of focused around Stevenson's purpose, which I feel like is kind of twofold. I feel like it's to expose the hypocrisy of men that was inherent in Victorian society. And I think Stevenson wanted to hold a mirror up to this society and warn the reader about the danger of not creating more acceptance around people and human beings. Because I think it's really clear that Stevenson highlights the complexity of human beings. He highlights how science is developing. He highlights the creation, the kind of danger around creating outsiders that happens in Victorian society. And he talks a lot about natural urges, and I think he has some quite strong opinions on human beings' natural urges and how we should accept many of these. So I'm going to focus on two main areas. I'm going to focus on the exploration of the suppression of homosexuality. Now, some of you will have read this into Jekyll and Hyde, and some of you might not have, and that's fine. Okay, so we'll start there. I'm going to tell you why I think Stevenson talks a lot about the suppression of homosexuality. And I'm also going to look at some psychoanalysis with you all, and how and science, and how the growing understanding of the human mind and human nature that was coming out of the Victorian period is highlighted in the text, and how Stevenson kind of pits this against the kind of outdated structures, and how we've got this kind of we're getting this bigger understanding of the human mind and human nature. However, we're still trying to maintain outdated structures. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. Okay. I'm going to start with the theme of homosexuality, which I think is evident in Jekyll and Hyde. Quite a lot we are told about an untold vice that Jekyll has, and we're never quite sure what that vice is. We're never told exactly what that vice is. Jekyll talks about it himself in the statement of the case that he makes towards the end of the novella. I would argue, and some others would argue, that the untold vice that Stevenson is referring to is homosexuality. Now, I feel like Stevenson definitely incorporates subtle hints that Jekyll may be homosexual. Now, it's believed that explicit references to Jekyll and Hyde's sexual vices might have concerned Stevenson's wife because of his reputation as a writer of children's novels. For me, part of the tragedy included in the novel, one of the big reasons that I think Stevenson wrote this is because he wanted to highlight that he didn't believe that being homosexual should be a crime as it was when he wrote the novel. I feel like we get a strong, I think you could read and infer that he feels like that shouldn't have been the case, and rightly so. Okay, the only reason for softening his original ideas and not making this kind of theme of homosexuality explicit was because it would have been too sensitive to be published. And he's a writer, and he was writing because that was his living, and obviously he needed to make money, and he wrote children's novels, and all those things played a part in him deciding not to be explicit about homosexuality. And in all honesty, and I'm going to give you some kind of context around this, had he been explicit, the novel wouldn't have been published. So why do I think that there's a sensitivity around this idea of homosexuality? Why do I think that Stevenson didn't believe it should be a crime, and that Stevenson actually was trying to highlight kind of that being a homosexual was normal and okay? It wasn't a bad thing. So it's believed that in an early draft of Jekyll and Hyde, Jekyll confesses that from an early age, I became in secret a slave of certain appetites. Now, again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this idea of appetites, but if you read that from an early age, it's clear that Stevenson is saying that if it's my reading, that his vice and appetites are linked to his sexuality, that actually being a homosexual is not something that we are taught, but something we are born with. So he's talking about it being from an early age. It was cut. This part of the novel was cut from the final draft because, although still subtle, it was not subtle enough for a Victorian reader. And it was replaced with, and indeed the worst of my faults was a certain impatient gaiety of disposition, hard to reconcile with my imperious desire to carry my head high and wear a more than commonly grave countenance before the public. Appearances and our respectability, when we're talking about that in Jekyll and Hyde, is a crucial theme. It's really important. It's a really important theme. So the fact that Jekyll wanted to wear a cape that was wear something that was kind of more acceptable isn't that surprising when you look at the novel. Other examples from the novel that point to Stevenson's exploration of homosexuality is a big one is Jekyll and Hyde's kind of suspicious and puzzling relationship with Utterson all the way through, which Utterson assumes is born out of blackmail. Again, I'm going to come back to blackmail in this lecture because that's a really key point when it comes to understanding kind of where we're reading in this idea of homosexuality. Structurally, the reason we find out so late, I think, in the novella about the true origin of this relationship, that Jekyll is Hyde and Hyde is Jekyll, is so that we can have our suspicions about their relationship. Because I think Stevenson wanted to, as subtly as he can, create suspicion around what that relationship was. Why would Hyde have had access to Jekyll's house? Why would he be the recipient of Jekyll's will? We can only assume the relationship that they have is a close one, that requires easy access to each other. So I think that's a really important point. I said earlier, I'm going to talk a little bit about context, and this is crucial. Understanding the context of today we are not talking about homosexuality in the same way, thank goodness, as they did in the Victorian era. And actually, why did it need to be so subtle? Why was it something Stevenson might be thinking about when he was writing Jekyll and Hyde? Why might it be something Stevenson wanted to make a point about? So contextually, it leads to the question, was being a homosexual something that people would have been conscious of at that time? Well, yes is the answer to that. Okay, so 14 years before the novel was written, there was a huge British scandal. Ernest Ellen Bolton and Frederick Fanny Park, who were two Victorian transvestites, were charged with conspiring and charging persons to commit unnatural acts. Even in the wording of that, it's again subtle. You can tell that they've not talked about homosexuality there. They refer to it as unnatural acts. Now, the indictment was against Lord Arthur Clinton. So we can see that this person's in nobility, this person had a reputation to protect, and certain people were blamed for indicting this. So the prosecution were unable at this time to prove that being a transvestite was an offence, because at the time of the trial, no law existed to say it was an offence. Being a transvestite wasn't a crime. So what I find interesting about this is, even though all prosecuted were acquitted, including Lord Clinton killed himself before the trial. So when you start to think of Jekyll and Hyde, and you start to think of Jekyll being found out that he's Hyde, he does the very same thing. So you can start to draw some connection between the character Jekyll and the character Lord Clinton. Well, the person, sorry. Other important contextual information and things to know is that homosexuality and blackmail were tightly linked together. So we talked about, when we think about blackmail, that's all the way through Jekyll and Hyde. That's referenced all the way through. So it's another link that you could make between the novel and kind of this theme of homosexuality being something that Stevenson wanted to highlight. I think what is really, really, really significant in the Victorian era is that being a homosexual could be prosecuted on the flimsiest of evidence. Just the revelation of a potential encounter with another man could be enough to send a person to prison, which I think is actually why that kind of opportunistic nature of people who use blackmail as a means to capitalise on people that may have been homosexual, there was a willingness to pay people off, because you could be prosecuted on such little evidence that people just didn't even want it associated. And reputation would have been another reason. You didn't want, if you look at all the reasons that Jekyll creates Hyde, it's all about protecting his reputation. So again, not muddying your reputation in any way, that would be another reason to pay someone off. So we think about Hyde, we think about him being paid off a number of times. There's the story about the trampling of the girl. Paying someone off is significant. I've talked about blackmail being consistently referenced in the relationship to Jekyll and Hyde. Enfield says he has one answer for the relationship: blackmail, I suppose. Utterson talks about and says, it turns me cold to think of this creature stealing like a thief to Harry's bedside. So it is really interesting how he is assuming that Hyde has got something over Jekyll and therefore is blackmailing him. And we've just talked about blackmail linked to this idea of being homosexual. Obviously, there's really tight links. And I've already said this, but any reference to homosexuality had to be subtle, just as it was in real life. Again, unnatural acts, as mentioned in the trial 14 years earlier. The other thing is, the novel's about male bachelors. Jekyll, Utterson, Lanyon, Enfield, they are all unmarried men. And in fact, if you think about that wasn't common at the time. You would have expected them to be married. So again, Stevenson's talking to us about a number of unmarried men, something that you wouldn't have expected. And in fact, by incorporating a number of unmarried men who might be deemed to be homosexual, you could argue, and I probably would argue, that Stevenson is highlighting how normal homosexuality was. We've got a whole novel full of men that potentially could be homosexual. It wasn't uncommon, and nor should it have been uncommon. I would argue that homosexuality is a thinly veiled theme throughout the novella. And some examples of that, even the behaviour of Sir Danvers Carew could be questioned. He's accosting Hyde before Hyde kills him with a very pretty manner. He's out at night under the veil of darkness. This idea of secrecy and hiding something. Accosting suggests he wants something from Hyde. The pretty manner, all of these things could be a subtle hint towards Sir Danvers Carew being homosexual. And Stevenson leaves all characters open for question. Nobody is what they appear to be in this novella. There are undertones to all characters all the way through. We're never quite sure who someone is. And I think all this leads us to question Stevenson's experience of homosexuality as a person. Now, I'm not going to take credit for this because I've just done the research, but a biographer called Claire Harmon did unpick this a little bit, homosexuality and Stevenson, because I think his message is only that homosexuality shouldn't be a crime. I don't think we get a negative impression of homosexuality. I think we get a negative impression of the Victorian era in this novel. So people, it led to questions about Stevenson's sexuality. Now, I have to say there is no evidence at all that Stevenson had any homosexual relationships. However, he did strongly reject Victorian values when it came to his personal life. So he married an older woman who was divorced, and so he didn't strictly follow the same pattern that you would expect of a Victorian gentleman. His style of dress was also described to be quite feminine. They described it as fair. So if you look at Stevenson, there's no kind of real link to his own sexuality. But scholar Andrew Lang, who was gay, it was recorded that he said about Stevenson that Stevenson possessed more than any other man I've ever met the power of making other men fall in love with him. Now, perhaps he was a biased scholar, okay? Or perhaps he could sense that Stevenson accepted homosexuality and actually how sympathetic Stevenson was towards the treatment of it. It was argued that Stevenson loved the attention and could not be unaware of kind of his connection with homosexual men, and that Stevenson was flattered by that. It is clear from all the research that he did not find homosexuality disgusting, like most other people claimed to feel, and I use that term, claimed to feel at the time. But most likely he found society's reaction to it disgusting. Hence the cautionary tale that he tells in Jekyll and Hyde about the potential dangers created by the Victorian way of life. Because Hyde is a creation of that way of life, and Hyde is not someone I would want to run into anytime soon. So we're going to unpick that a little bit further as well. So could this be another reason why Jekyll had to die at the end? If a person is unable to truly be themselves, then can that person truly exist anyway? Okay, so that's my kind of take on the theme of homosexuality. I want to talk a little bit about the psychoanalytical element and the science element of the novella as well. So in the Victorian era, there was a growing understanding of the human mind and human nature, but society was still trying to maintain outdated structures in fear of change. Okay, in many ways, Jekyll can be seen as a superego, that portion of the human consciousness that attempts to control the physical urges of the id, here represented by Hyde, and filter them through socially appropriate activities. However, when the id is repressed, rather than integrated into a functioning psyche, the individual's behaviour will grow increasingly more erratic. It is inevitable that in a time that in time, whenever whatever is repressed will once again become manifest. And what occurs is what psychologists call the return of the repressed. In Stevenson's work, Jekyll and Hyde, Jekyll is increasingly unable to control his alter ego. His identity becomes fragmented into Jekyll and Hyde, and then Hyde's persona begins to manifest itself unexpectedly. The id, as manifested in the persona of Hyde, requires ever more extreme forms of oppression, such as complete suppression of this identity through Jekyll's refusal to take the drug that causes the transformation. The most extreme form of oppression is self-annihilation, as readers see when Jekyll kills himself to repress Hyde. A question frequently asked about the novel is the nature of what is being repressed by Jekyll. What precisely are the strange vices that Jekyll feels so compelled to act upon that he can't do as Jekyll in Victorian society? And there's two kind of provocative answers here. One would be his homosexual desires, and the other would be that the other link might be that he drug abuse would be the second one. So you could explore that yourself further. I'm not going to explore that today. I do want to talk a little bit more about kind of the science around that was growing at the time that I think is important to kind of what Stevenson produced as a novella, and it's the double brain I want to look at. So Anna Stiles, who had a PhD in Victorian literature, looks at the double brain in relationship to Jekyll and Hyde. And she argues that though Stevenson claimed he had no previous knowledge of psychological ideas of multiple personalities, he may have read several scientific articles at the time published in medical journals about this condition, which inspired him to write several works. During the Victorian era, contemporary scientists were discussing the idea that everyone has a double brain. And as they saw it, it was the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere were associated with distinct attributes. So, and this still remains true today. That's how we look at the brain today. And that person may have the opposing sides pulling them towards specific characteristics. So this is from Stiles. While Jekyll exhibits left hemisphere attributes like masculinity and logic and intelligence, Hyde embodies right hemisphere traits like femininity, madness, emotion, those types of traits. Stevenson may also have heard about the dual brain theory, where the right and left hemispheres could act independently, such that an overactive right brain might lead someone to be very emotional and irrational, committing irrational acts such as murder, for example. Stiles discusses an article, The Brain of Criminal Lunatics, by the psychologist David Ferrier in 1882, where he discovered an over-enlarged right hemisphere and an abnormally small left hemisphere during an autopsy of a woman who was mentally ill and murdered all her children. So, scientists were really starting to look into the brain and how the brain worked and what that could tell us about human nature. During the Victorian era, many scientists proposed the idea of needing to equally exercise both areas of the brain in order to prevent one side of the dual brain from taking over. Stevenson likened this idea to the dual brain in Jekyll and Hyde. So the double brain. In the beginning, Jekyll and the right brain was a dominant personality. But as the story progresses, Jekyll increasingly turns into Hyde. This secondary persona strengthens until eventually Jekyll is no longer in control and Hyde can appear whenever he wants. So if you talk about exercising one side of the brain to the other, you get a sense that the more that Hyde, that side of the brain, is exercised via Jekyll, he becomes a much stronger part of who Jekyll is. I find the title fascinating with this as well, because the title kind of almost it tells us about this kind of multiple personalities and duality in humans, and Stevenson's clearly done this on purpose. He calls it the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So in other words, Stevenson does not merely reproduce the typical form of a case study, which was generally quite dry and emotional and detached from the patient's suffering, but actually he combines the basic structure of the case study. So we are presented the novel as a case study with a tone and subject matter more appropriate to Gothic, so that his novella suffers from a case of split personality as well, like that of the protagonist, Jekyll. The logical left brain perspective of science combined with the primitive emotional right brain perspective of Gothic, demonstrating how Stevenson incorporates the polarities of the dual brain theory in the literary form of his famous novella. And it's called The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, so it's not called The Case, it gives it some emotion in the title itself. Okay, science. Darwin's theory of evolution. Like, many of you will know quite a lot about Darwin's theory of evolution, but the existence of this scientific theory led to questions against God and the Bible. It scared the Victorian reader. It scared them because it started to question everything that they'd been brought up to believe. It put that into question. And they also start to feel like, well, if humans evolve, they questioned whether they might be able to devolve. And that all links to urban terror. And, we talk about the influx of the working classes into London and into many cities. They were suddenly seeing a different type of human being in their eyes than they were used to as Victorian gentlemen. So they were concerned by this theory. They were concerned by what that meant for their people and what might happen to them, I guess. They were concerned by science that was uncontrolled. So rather than face it, and rather than kind of learn more about it and spend some time getting to know it, they chose to ignore it. And Lanyon and Jekyll's relationship symbolises this kind of ignorance that I think Stevenson writes about so well in this novel. He talks about Lanyon referring to Jekyll's relationship with science as unscientific balderdash. And what Lanyon does with Jekyll is he chooses to distance himself from him rather than understand him and take time to kind of be part of what Jekyll is doing and understand it more. Knowledge is power, and we know that. So the fact that rather than, if something scares you, you turn away from it rather than kind of face it head on and understand it. I feel like Stevenson argues really well, and again, my interpretation that ignorance is not the answer. We cannot ignore the new things that we learn because we can't hide forever. Humans have a natural curiosity, and actually, again, this is evident through the character Lanyon, because although Lanyon is given the choice not to watch Hyde drink the potion that turns him back into Jekyll, and obviously Lanyon did not know what would happen to Hyde when he drank that potion. He was asked if he wanted to not see it. He chose to watch. So it was actually Lanyon's natural curiosity mixed with his inability to accept change, metaphorically and literally, that leads to his untimely death. Because we know that Lanyon dies of shock. And Lanyon wouldn't have been shocked if he didn't watch. And Lanyon wouldn't have died of shock if he could have been accepting of something he didn't understand, and he could have kind of worked through that and tried to be part of understanding that, and maybe supporting and helping Jekyll repress Hyde a little bit more than he had control over doing at the time. So for me, it feels like we're getting told that acceptance is the answer, that we need to get rid of the outsider and bring the outsider in. And this is a difficult one to explain, because I'm not saying that Stevenson thought what Hyde did was okay, because it absolutely wasn't. But actually, I am saying that Stevenson is, in my opinion, suggesting that if Jekyll and the other characters lived in a more accepting world where they weren't made to feel outsiders because of the way, for their sexuality, or for things that they shouldn't have felt anyway about, really, then Hyde would have been unnecessary. Hyde wouldn't have existed as an outsider. And for me, I obviously have read Jekyll and Hyde since, but before I read Jekyll and Hyde, my only understanding of it was that it was symbolic of extreme sides of one's personality. And obviously that is evident there. There is some symbolism around that. But for me, the biggest part of Jekyll and Hyde highlights how Stevenson certainly lacked respect for Victorian gentlemen's way of life. He did not like the heavy-handed moral righteousness that existed in that Victorian upper class, and I think that he highlights that through his characters, because none of them are particularly likable as characters. They're all hypocritical, and actually they want to maintain these outdated structures, but they want to also live, Jekyll particularly wants to then maintain the outdated structures, but be hide some of the time so he can be free. Actually bring those two things together, and you've got a much nicer world to live in. I also feel like I get a sense that Stevenson's a little bit of an outsider, or feels a little bit of an outsider in this society. And I don't feel like he belonged there. I think he was ahead of his time, and I think he just really wanted to hold that mirror up and say, look at what you are selling to people, and then who we actually are. Like let's take the facade away, and let's be people. Because it was a case. It's the case. The strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Hyde. It was a case because he wanted us to make judgments about the way that they lived. He wanted us to judge these characters, and that's why he set it up as a case. Often I get asked, why did he choose the Gothic genre? The Gothic genre was often used in at the time to highlight Victorian cultural fears, and Jekyll and Hyde carries a really clear moral message about the hypocrisy of these fears. It's believed that's one of the main reasons it was Gothic, but he wanted to create a sense of fear to truly highlight the danger of the Victorian world, and what this world was creating. So he needed the Gothic to ramp up that fear, because actually they need to be scared of what world they are living in. They need to be scared of that world, because that world was dangerous for so many reasons, and made so many people unhappy. That change was really, really necessary. So whilst the upper classes were really fearful of scandal, urban terror, actually it's clear that the thing they should have been most terrified of was their way of life, and what that way of life created for people, them and others. I often think about what I find frightening about Jekyll and Hyde, and the obvious answer is, Hyde, the character, and the things he does to people, and obviously that is frightening. That's incredibly frightening. But I think I find what Hyde represents more frightening: the fact that he represents outsiders, and the fact that they had so many outsiders in this society, because if you were perfect, you didn't get accepted by these men. And actually, when many of the people they rejected were them, basically at their core, that feels quite frightening to me. Human beings were not allowed to act like human beings in the Victorian era. They had humans trying to exist in almost like a one-dimensional way. And the way the word straitjacketed is used by Jekyll to describe how he felt. So you get a sense that he felt straitjacketed, and I think people were straitjacketed in this time. Hyde is a blind, actually, I'm going to start again. I feel like this kind of, what am I trying to say? A blind that masks reality and means they can't see what's in front of them. They use this kind of, these moral standards to they were so obsessed with them that it became almost like a block for them. They couldn't see what was coming ahead, so it made a lot of them really, really vulnerable, because they stood by these moral standards. For me, without the need to repress in fear of a loss of respectability, without this unachievable moral standard, without acceptance of difference, every human being is hiding some part of themselves. And ultimately, it leads to a dissatisfaction, which in Jekyll's case leads to Hyde, who is limitless. Hyde does not exist in any of these social kind of expectations because he's completely outside of them. And if he represents an outsider, and there are so many outsiders created in this society, then that kind of highlights just how dangerous he is and just how dangerous an outsider is. So for me, actually, I think we would all agree that it's necessary to maintain some sense of civility, to have, boundaries are necessary for that. So by pushing people to the side, making them outsiders, you are creating a really frightening, dangerous community of people, and that's what happens with Hyde. I don't feel like the message is that Jekyll wanted to murder people, so he became Hyde to do that. I think that Jekyll wanted to be himself, and the only way he could do that without fear of not damaging his reputation was by doing it as someone else. And actually, by creating Hyde, he became even more limitless, and that's what happened. Hyde then ended up doing things that he should have been ashamed of, rather than doing the things I think Jekyll would have done that in today's society certainly wouldn't have been shameful and shouldn't have been shameful then. This is just a quick kind of run through some ideas in Jekyll and Hyde, and I want to say to you that you might disagree, and that's okay. And please do come chat to me about that, because everyone's got their own view of what Jekyll and Hyde is about, and I love listening to your views on this text as well. And there's so much more. I could literally talk to you for about 10 hours. And underestimation there. I could talk to you for 10 weeks about this novel. So the warning is, if you disagree, that's okay. And please, just have a think about how you feel about the text. It is a really good one to study in terms of just, there's lots of subtleties and lots of things that you could read into these characters. So please, enjoy it and make sure you go back and have a look at it. So thanks very much. Take care. I'll see you all soon.